Hello and welcome back to Random Subaru Stuff. In this video I'm going to talk about the Banks Power iDash, SuperGauge, and DataMonster, specifically in relation to older Subaru WRXs. And when I say older, I'm talking about pre-2008. And so we'll talk about why we're differentiating between the years. And we'll talk about sort of my opinions about the gauge and some considerations for why you might want it or why you might not want it. And again, just my opinions. So, for starters, why differentiate between older Subarus and newer Subarus? Well, so this Banks iDash product was developed to work with CAN bus ECMs, and Subaru, at least on the WRX, didn't go to a CAN bus system until I believe it was 2008. So my 2006 Hawkeye here is pre-CAN bus. So that means that the gauge can't do everything that it would be able to do for a 2008 or later CAN bus based car, and it's not just WRX, right? So I believe it will work with any CAN bus ECM. So it's not made specifically for Subarus. They're not, special models for each make or anything like that. So, but on a CAN bus system, it knows how to talk to CAN bus and get any of the sensor data out of the CAN bus ECM. So just wanted to get that out of the way. So here I am. I'm in my 2006 Hawkeye WRX pre-CAN bus, and so I had to install the iDash gauge in what they call standalone mode, which means that it is completely separate from the ECM. It's not, and is also therefore not capable of pulling any values out of the ECM. So like a Cobb access port, I believe was made specifically for the WRX, and it knows how to get certain data out of the ECM, and just sort of just like that. But that was, again, for at least for the Hawkeye, that was also designed in the pre-CAN bus world. So next I'm going to kind of compare some of the standard or common reliability modifications that people do to their Subarus. So if you've been around the Subaru community, you've probably seen something like what I have installed here. The installed but not wired up is like a dual gauge pod. This happens to be a SMY gauge pod that allowed me to install two different gauges, additionally one on each side of the steering column. Like I said, I just never got around to wiring them up, but they're installed. Now, some of the nice things about this setup is, and these are the Pro Sport gauges, so those are affordable gauges. They come in a kit of a gauge and a sensor, and you can see like the style matches very well. So you probably can't see through the tint. But it has red needles just like the rest of the gauges. They have green backlighting just like the OEM gauges, and they have this silver bezel which blends in very well with the gauges. So it's a nice option, and they look good. Now I'll leave it up to you to research your own on the quality of those things, but they're affordable, and I would say they're probably good enough for just sort of, if you just want to keep an eye on your oil temperature or oil pressure over time, which is typically what the gauges that people will install on these turbo Subarus is oil temperature, oil pressure, and that just kind of allows you to keep track of of those things which are good for reliability, right? You want to make sure your oil's not getting too hot, you want to make sure the pressure's good and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a common setup for turbo Subarus. Well, what happens if you want to add a third gauge, right, or a third sensor? Where are you going to display it? Where are you going to put your gauge? You're going to put it on the, you're going to put it on the A pillar. Are you going to, you're going to put it in the center stack with a triple gauge cluster or something like that. Okay, and then what if you want to add a fourth gauge or a fourth sensor? Then what? So anyway, so that's where the bank's product, I feel like, comes in, has some benefits, or comes in to be a good option here. So again, this is wired up in standalone mode, and this is the wire to my cob access port. So it's not part of this bank setup. And because my WRX is pre-CAN bus, sometimes I will run both the cob access port and the bank's gauge, and the bank's gauge would display the sensor values that I've added on additional to the car. And so in particular, you can see, so I do have engine oil temperature. I think the glare is a little sunny where I'm at here. So EOT is engine oil temperature. There's oil P for oil pressure. And then I've also added a coolant. I've also added a coolant pressure. So already, I'm up to 3 gauges. And the coolant pressure, that's probably a little overkill, but again, if I ever have a head gasket sort of failure and start pushing pressure into the coolant system, maybe I'll be able to tell with that. And then these other values, and you can see it's also pulling a battery voltage, which that's stock out of the box. I didn't have to do anything there. As soon as I wired it up, it was able to pull that voltage. And then the other 2 squares that I have configured here on this page is an ambient air temperature and an ambient air density, and that comes off of another add-on Banks module, which is like an air measurement module, and so it's doing some calculations there. So now, again, do I really care about those? No, but they fill out, they fill out the six value page here, and so which that's fairly similar to some of the things you can do with the cob access port. Although the Banks thing, you can actually configure, I think it's 5 different gauge pages, with each of them having its own separate set of values, which I don't think you can do that in the cob access port. I think you get 1 page of gauges, and you have to turn one value off and add another value into the page, but I think it's just 1 page. I could be wrong. Maybe it's different on the newer models, I'm not sure. But anyway, this isn't really to compare with the access port or anything. I'm just saying kind of similar multi-gauge kind of features here. So my recommendations, okay. Now I have the Banks gauge. I like it. I like its configurability, and I have it installed loose. I can tighten that up, but that's fine. It's really not a big deal. But some of the things I really like about the Banks gauge is it's very configurable. You can change all the colors you see on there. You can change them. You can configure them. You have different layouts you can do. And then the other thing is I've opted for the DataMonster variant, which you can see there's a little SD card in the front of it, and there is also just a SuperGauge. If you don't really care about logging the data, you can just get one without the. It wouldn't be a DataMonster. It would be just the Banks iDash SuperGauge. And it would be a little less expensive. So now I'll share some of my own personal recommendations, and the discussion will be, would I recommend a two pod, a 2 gauge setup versus a Banks setup? Well, the obvious factor to compare would be cost. Okay, so with this kind of setup, with the dual gauge pod setup, you're talking about, you got to buy a some kind of cluster surround. You have to get 2 gauges and 2 sensors, and then you have to wire them. You have to obviously wire them in to the car. So maybe a little bit of labor, a gauge cluster surround, and 2 gauge and sensor kits. All right. So with Pro Sport, fairly affordable, right? But if you you know, if you're putting in AEM gauges, first off, I'm not sure if they would fit here, but like, let's say you're getting AEM or one of the higher end, higher end set of gauges, that's going to add on the cost, right? So if all you were going to do was add 2 gauges, I probably would recommend just going this route, okay, and keep it separate. But if you want a data log, well, now what are you going to do? What are your options there? And if you want to add a 3rd or 4th or 5th sensor and gauge, well, then what's your plan? The other thing is the bank system, it's modular. You can add more modules to it, so you can add more sensors and gauges or gauge values. You can actually daisy chain in to like a DataMonster and a SuperGauge. You can have them side by side if you wanted to. Of course, you'd have to buy a second gauge for that. The other nice thing is, I think what I was starting to say is, the other nice thing is, once you get this thing wired in, you're only ever going to have the one cable running into the car, or there's only one cable coming to the gauge. The way it works is your sensors, which would, in this case, would be in your engine bay, your sensors plug into a module that I have, like for myself, I have installed in the engine bay, and the sensors feed in a single wire that comes to this gauge. So no matter how many sensors you wire in, there's still only one wire coming. There's only one signal wire coming to the gauge. Whereas if you add on to a system like independent gauges like this, you're going to have to keep wiring more and more wires into your car to come to each individual gauge. So that's another nice thing about the bank setup. So there's that. And then when you start getting into things like boost and I say boost, but when we talk about air pressures and if you wanted to monitor air pressure, air temperature, then the bank's device will do some automatic calculations for you and tell you what your overall pressures are and stuff like that. So there's some trick things that the SuperGauge can do for you as well. But again, going back to that, if all you're concerned about is cost and all you're doing is adding a couple of gauges into, just like if all you're doing is adding 2 gauges, maybe oil temperature, oil pressure, from a cost perspective, most likely individual gauges is going to be less expensive. But again, if you like the form, you like the configurability, you like the single gauge simplicity, well then how do you put a price on that? Like what makes that a good value versus compared to the cost of separate gauges? If you want a data log, well, yes, it's a slightly more expensive variant of the bank's product, but again, what's that worth to you versus maybe a gauge that can log maybe a couple second sweep or something like that, but so anyway, you got to figure out what that's worth to you as well. So anyway, and again, I just want to be clear, if you have a car after 2008, the bank's product should be able to handle you through over the CAN bus system, and you have all those nice CAN bus sensor values already available to you, and you can configure your pages and your gauge pages and all that stuff. So there you go. I think it's a pretty good overview of the bank's product and sort of some recommendations based on considering the cost and stuff like that. I might do a more detailed breakdown of the different components that I have had to purchase and install to get the get the Banks gauge working the way it is. But again, you know, so anyway, but that's kind of a breakdown. Is you know, you have to kind of compare the cost between what it is that you're trying to do. And now for me, I'm going to you know, I have plans to add even more sensors onto this thing, and so, you know, for me, the expandability is also worth the price for me. And so again, you got to figure out what's your goal, what are your plans for your car, and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's a pretty good intro and overview of the product, and maybe comparison to your other options or other common options. You know, if you have a standalone ECU, like if you're doing real race car stuff, and you have a standalone ECU, then, you know, then there's other things that the Banks can do for you. I think it wires into most of the common CAN bus based aftermarket ECUs as well, but you'd have to research that on your own. So anyway, just wanted to cover the product. If you're familiar about it but not sure, or maybe you've never ever heard about it before, there's some food for thought, or something to consider if you want to add maybe a little more monitoring to your vehicle as these things get older, or if you're you know, doing track day stuff or race car stuff. Anyway, so there you go. Thanks for watching. Please drive safe.